come to Art 4, and this is a painting by Max Ernst done in 1958 called Tomb of the Poet. All his life, he identified himself as a bird, and so the bird spirit flies free. But if you look at the wings of the bird, they're almost like the eyes of a supernatural creature, of a surreal creature. It is a symbolic, natural form that can fly, but as a surreal, supranatural form that can see. And what it sees hovering above a brilliant white volume below it. In mystical Judaism, this is called Shekinah, and it means the spiritual presence of the divine. And the tomb of the poet is that the poet does not die and does not stay in the tomb, but the tomb is but a gateway through which the poet reemerges. And that the tomb that always occurs are the limitations that other people put on you to identify you that this is who you are. The psychological profile, the sociological coordinates, the economic limitations, the political configurations, the religious denominations, all of these shuns that try to fix us. And one of the central pivots that we're working with now is that art forms mediate two very large kinds of forms. Art forms are personal. There's always an artist. There's always a work of art, and we're going to talk in just a little bit about the work of art. But art forms that are personal are spirit forms as well, because they're the first forms that emerge out of consciousness. That they are not in nature as body and mind, because what emerges in body emerges objectively because of ritual comportment that is selected action that leads to a result. So that bodies are existentially always karmic. They're always karmic. They're based on action, purposeful action, that when completed will have then done this, and one can tote that up and it amounts to this ritual form, which is objective. And even in nature, the universe itself achieves objectivity in just this way. If the energy frequency is of such and such a level, that focus will be a particle called, say, an electron. If it has a similar kind of energy, but at a higher focus, you will not have an electron, but you'll have a muon. That will be the same family of particle as electron, but of a higher energy. And there's even a third kind of electron called the tau particle. It's very high energy. The forms that art forms mediate are not ritual forms. They displace ritual forms in the square of our attention, so that the forms that art forms mediate are the symbolic forms of the mind and the scientific form of the cosmos. So that the mind and the cosmos, in a very special way, are the farthest parenthetical reaches of the spiritual artist who is able to make a person. Not to make a person out of themselves, but to release the personal spectrum. Because it's that personal spectrum that is released that gives that rainbow that gives that capacity for a person to have a facility to be multidimensional. Not just dimensional in terms of space and time, but to add consciousness, like a fifth dimension, and to add the person as a form, as a sixth dimension. So that in a very real way, spirit achieves form in 6 dimensions. So that one has a very high phenomenon. It is 2 orders above the complete integral of time-space or space-time. So that when one is looking through the prismatic lens of an artistic spirit as your person range, you see space-time, the universe of space-time, from a perspective that is 2 orders above it, or 2 orders larger than it, expanded, or 2 orders of magnitude that are more penetrating into it, or more distant from it. So that the artist who achieves this spirit person form begins to have these kinds of capacities and to express them like Max Ernst or like George O'Keeffe. And it is a profound realization that the individuality in the mind is several orders different from the artistic person who you could express, which obviates then that identification of all the shuns, of all the stylizations that you are supposed to be in such a calibration, such a denomination, such a configuration, whatever it is, all those shuns. It is important that the mind gain an integral of individuality. That's not the issue here. But to mistake the mental individuality for one's spirit person is a fatal flaw. And one of the ways in which that fatal flaw registers is that one begins to lean on a profile of psychology rather than to explore a spectrum of possibility. And so one has a very precarious situation. There was a very brilliant Jungian analyst. His name was Medard Boss. He's in Europe, in Zurich. And he came up with a realization from a different kind of psychology. It was called Existential Phenomenology, which was founded by Ludwig Binswanger, a very powerful thinker early in the 20th century. And Medard Boss shifted from a Jungian psychology to the existential phenomenology of Binswanger. And he came to characterize it this way, that if you depend upon the mind's structure for your psychological configuration, given the Western penchant for using symbolic contexts that are very powerful to stylize that, you come up with a cross. You come up with a coordinate that stands more and more like on a crucified type of a cross, not just a St. Andrew's even cross, but more and more the experience of the disappointments of life and everything, that the bottom becomes more and more like a symbolic coordination that things are horrible, that it all does lead to death, that it leads to being singled out and incarcerated and sacrificed. He says at that point where that bottom part of the cross is long enough and your sense of disappointment in life is high enough, that cross becomes top-heavy and it falls to one side or the other. And instead of having a cross, one gets an X. One gets an unknown. And that one's individuality that had become more and more habitually grounded in this kind of orientation, all of a sudden is disoriented completely. And that this produces not just suffering, but despair. Not just difficult life, but a crisis of existence itself. All of this is gathered and garnered into this pernicious flaw, which has been embedded in several different waves of civilization. Now, it was never there in our species before about 6,000 years ago. It just simply never occurred in our species before and began to obtrude its origins about that time, about 4,000 BC. And one of the classic expressions of this a long time ago, 3,000 years ago, about midway in that 6,000 year period, about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 BC, actually it's about 1,200 BC. When Moses wrote the book of Genesis, he says that the first man was Adam, and then gives the generations of Adam. And many people and many times have gone through the generations of Adam to find out, well, when did he live? And the date that surfaces is that he would have been born in 4004 BC. So the whole thing of the religious stylization of man descended from Adam goes back to this poignant threshold of the beginnings of a sense of individuality in the mind in terms of the first emergence of it to be strong enough to blur the ancient traditional sense. And the ancient traditional sense was never the individuality in the mind, but was always the capacity for your experience to flow with nature. And when your mythic horizon of language, of images, of feeling, of your character is able to participate in the natural process, not the natural order so much, but in the natural process. Thoreau once said, the civilized man is the natural complement to the four seasons. In the winter, he's at home with winter. In the summer, he's at home with summer, so forth. As long as our species was able to participate with nature such that the flow of experience, the process of myth, and the flow of nature, the process of nature, as long as they were able to not have a synchronization, but a participation together. The best phrase for it was a phrase that was developed by a French philosophic anthropologist, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. And he used the term participation mystique. It is a participation that has a mystic quality to it. Because in nature it is mysterious, but in one's experience, it isn't so much mysterious, but it is mystical. It is mystical because you realize that as your experience becomes really absorbed in nature, it isn't just that you're absorbed into nature, but nature is absorbed into your experience as well. So that now the ritual action does not have an ability to register itself in the gears of karma. because ritual is the objective form between nature and myth, between mythic experience and natural process. And if experience is into nature, participating to the extent that it is mystical as much as nature is mysterious, because ritual objectivity has come out of nature, it now not only comes out of nature, but it likewise will come out of your experience as well. So that ritual activity in the natural ecology, before the obtrusion of individuality in the mind, can achieve a very deep, scintillating quality of not just being together, but of occurring together. There's a symmetrical simultaneity, and one can feel that. It means then that one's experience becomes so tuned to nature that you feel the occurrences of nature as a part of one's own character, and that the character then flows with it, and one can be ebullient. About 5,000 years ago, the way in which the original Chinese sage Fu Xi found the symbols of the 8 trigrams that became the base of the I Ching was being so immersed in nature and nature absorbed in his experience, he was able to observe in this special mysterious mode a thunderstorm in the mountains. And he saw, not just with eyes of perception, but he saw with this symmetrical, mysterious synergy that the ritual steps that happen in existence always follow, do in fact follow, describe a limited ecology of steps. And he was able to observe this in such a way that his symbolic mind, not having its individuality to obtrude, but his symbolic mind just did the natural integral and found that there were 8 steps. That always occurs with 8 steps. And that the basis of the 8 steps was that there was a mysterious mystic pair that went to the 3rd order. 2 squared is 4, but 2 cubed is 8. And he found 5,000 years ago that when you cube a binary, you come up with a primordial symbolic vocabulary that is able very much, very accurately, to describe actual existential action in all of its complete steps. And it wasn't until this was worked with for a couple of thousand years, it took about 2,000 years, to discover that if you square the 8 and you get 64, by putting the trigrams together into hexagrams, that 64 hexagrams are a large enough matrix by which the detail that you can describe, not only existence in its ritual action, but you can describe also at the same time the structure of the mind, the structure of the symbolic mind. And that this is all consonant with a very permanent universal integral. Now we know for a long time now, more than half a century, that the DNA works by triplet codons, and there are 64 of those triplet codons, and that's one of the most primordial structures of DNA. And that DNA also has the double helix, it has the pairedness, but a pairedness which is in a complementarity. So that DNA not only is paired, but because it is in complementarity, it can interchange. Two different kinds of DNA can interchange with each other, and you get a child that has DNA from both. And that this is how life really does work. And it doesn't just work on the level of human beings. It works on the level of all organic life. And the most successful life form in the universe before our kind of life form is bacteria. This planet had bacteria 2 billion years before there was any other level of life form. And they were very successful because they learned through the natural integral ecology to exchange DNA in such a way that they repair each other's flaws that occur naturally. Why do they occur naturally? Because the universe is filled with radiation. Stars create radiation. There's all kinds of radiation. Low-level gamma radiation is generated by magnetars, which are neutron stars that are just packed neutron material, and they have star quakes, and sometimes they're larger than one could believe. About 4 months ago, we had a magnetar earthquake about 50,000 light years away that was called a monster. It was so strong that its magnetic disruption outshone our own sun. It was about 10,000 times the size of the largest supernova ever recorded. So the universe is filled with radiation, and what happens is that DNA, because of its long sequences, will naturally have mutations, but will also naturally have interruptions someplace on those sequences. And DNA can't repair itself. It has to go through an exchange, and the birth of sex, the birth of gender, occurs already on the bacterial level, because that's the only way that organisms can survive in a universe of radiation. What's deeply important for us is that in the last 6,000 years, the individually focused, integral mind has become more and more powerful, and in doing so, does not any longer, in a cultural way, naturally achieve the ability to transform into spiritual persons, into artists. And it became apparent about 4,000 years ago. About 4,000 years ago, the power of the symbolic individual mind was able to literally steamroller cultural traditions, tribal life, to the extent that it was literally almost flattened. And one had, for the very first time, not just very powerful city-states, but you had configurations of many city-states brought together in an empire. And one of the very first successful empires in the world was in what is today Iraq. And that was the empire that was manufactured about 2400 BC by Sargon the Great, Sargon of Akkad. And his empire is interesting. It's even more interesting and more powerful than the Egyptian Old Kingdom, which preceded it by about 500 years. Or dynastic China, which preceded it by about 500 years. Or the Indus civilization that preceded it by about 500 years as well. Around 3000 BC, you began to have empires. Egypt is 28 nomes brought into one empire. China's first dynasty, the legendary Shah, is a whole range of different kingdoms brought together to one empire. In India, the entire Indus River system, from the Himalayas all the way down to the Arabian Sea, was brought into an empire about 3000 BC. The original Mahabharata is the epic that records that, 3102 BC. But Sargon of Akkad's empire was very powerful because it was based on a Sumerian origin that went back several thousand years. And that they already understood that you don't just have a confederation of powerful city-states, but that those powerful city-states send out ganglia called trade routes, and that you begin to snag everything within possible reach into the exchange roundhouse that you control. And so the empire of Sargon of Akkad had the largest trade routes in the world at that time, the first time that it was enormous. And out of this, we get the classic phrase that used to be there in grade schools for 100 years called the Fertile Crescent. And what they meant by the Fertile Crescent at that time is they meant, well, it went from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. And Sargon of Akkad's empire spread on this Fertile Crescent. But we know now from 100 years of archaeology that it spread way, way beyond that. It went all the way to India, went all the way up into what is today Russia, went all the way over into Greece and Crete, all the way down into Egypt, so that it spanned an enormous area of the world. It spanned from the Ganges to the Rhine 4,500 years ago. Big power. But out of that came a crisis that was one of the worst crises that our species ever came across. And it had two different forms. It had a masculine crisis and it had a feminine crisis. And the very talented daughter of Sargon is the one who wrote those two epics, the first epics in the world. She's the first author in the world. Her name was Enneduanna. And the female version was the Epic of Inanna, and the masculine version was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And those two epics together have a third mediating epic. Its translated name from just the cognate of the old Akkadian is Atrahasis, and it's the original Genesis. The original flood story, the original coming out of things, so that you have a triad of epics 4,400 years ago that really characterize the crisis of a civilization which has not become a civilization, but it has become an empire. And one has to understand an empire is a regressed, failed civilization. Yeah, that's how they get there. That's how they get there. The failure of the Greco-Egyptian civilization led in regression to the founding of the Roman Empire. It's another classic difficulty about 2,000 years ago. And you find the crisis expressed everywhere at the time by the finest men and women, that it's a double crisis. We can achieve individuality in our thought, in our mind, but that then haunts us because we can't release our spirit. We can't find our spirit. And because we can't find our spirit, we lose consciousness and fall back into depending on rituals to give us some kind of traction. And those rituals have to be organized by symbolic ideologies to tell us how this works, and we become imprisoned. And the necessity, like addicts, to follow the directions, otherwise we're not going to be able to live. So you get caught into a vicious situation, and the double casualty is that the human spirit is no longer able to be free to engender itself and come out, and the civilization fails. It literally dies. There's never been a civilization on this planet that has lived. They have all died. Every single one of them has died. Arnold Toynbee spent his whole life doing a study of history. He identified 27 civilizations that have come and died, and the 28th he called Western Christendom, and he said in his time that it was ill and about to die, and that was 70 years ago, and since has died. So in a very poignant way, we are orphans twice over. We can't free our spirits and be personal in this largest differential sense of reality, nor do we have a civilization form that we could inhabit that would sustain us and help us and amplify so that what we do really does get done in the right way. And so we have a double task in the 21st century. We have to reestablish the freedom of the art of person emergence and reestablish a different civilization that doesn't suffer from the flaws of the past. And the first thing that happens is you don't make a plan, but you find a way to learn how to learn from scratch so that you learn from the beginning all the way through, and you learn in such a way that you don't assume the flaws of the past. And if you learn consistently in a natural ecology and then in a conscious expansion of that ecology, the flaws of the past are not cured because you found answers to them. They're cured because they never occur in the first place. They never happen in the first place. And one of the great surprises in a sophisticated, superior yoga or meditation or contemplation or prayer is when you go back through and yogically rearrange yourself or meditatively make yourself transparent or contemplatively penetrate through. When the errors and flaws that were there no longer have any place to engender themselves or register themselves, they disoccur as if they never occurred in the first place. And so the ancient word for that is that this is a dance of illusion then. This is Maya. Because it doesn't leave a trace anywhere. There are not any mystic wisps of graphite black smoke left someplace in the universe. It's completely open. It's not blank, it's just completely open. They don't register anywhere then. And the realization then, the classic way to describe it is when the old Zen master D.T. Suzuki first had this samadhi realization. He was about 21, 22 years old, 1890s Japan, Kyoto. His teacher, his Zen master, Shoyen Shaku, had said to him, you have an invitation to go to the United States, to Chicago, to make translations for Mr. Paul Karras, who runs the Open Court Publishing and the Open Court University in Chicago, but you can't go until you've had your Zen master samadhi. And if you don't, then you'll have to kill yourself. And he gave him a timeline. He said, you've got a couple of weeks, and at the end of this, if you don't have the samadhi, then harikiri. Japan's Zen is samurai-based, you see. Yeah. So D.T. Suzuki got to the last hour of the last evening of the last day and finally gave up. And as soon as he gave up, and about half an hour later, he heard a little tinkle of a wind chime, and it re-emerged him back out. And so he got up from the zendo, and he said he very quietly, humbly opened the doors, and he went outside and he looked around, and in the evening moonlight, he said all the trees were transparent. All the buildings of the zendo were transparent. He looked down on his own body, and straightening his tie, he said, I was transparent too. when the symbolic mind has transparent symbols, when they're open in that way, what flows through that transparency one way is experience, and what flows through it, the complementary way weaving with it, is consciousness. And when consciousness and experience flow through transparent symbols, they do a kind of a merging that is similar to nature and experience, absorbing together, except they flow in opposite ways, complementarity ways. And instead of having the parallel participation, they have the weaving participation. And what you get out of that is a whole different universe. Instead of a universe, you get a cosmos. It's called the jewel matrix. That every facet of every jewel infinitely shows infinite fractal universes as well. And out of that jewel matrix, one then realizes, well, that means then that the hidden quality of the universe has been released, and just as there is a spirit person now, able to make an art of themselves, they can exchange with all others, not just all other people, all other beings. And that when that exchange happens, the scintillation is trillions and trillions and trillions of times beyond just getting it into certainty in the mind. And out of this comes a spiritual realm of universal freedom, infinite freedom, and that the person recognizes that they're at home in that. And so whatever fearfulness or flaws there was before are, the phrase used to be, transcended. But it isn't that they're just transcended. It's that those flaws never occur. And it means that time in the past has been transformed as well. Not just the present, but that in the past they also now have never occurred. And what happened in the past now is like combed through, so it doesn't have the snarls that it had in the first place. And one gets a very magical realm. God lives there. Let's take a break. This is a painting by George O'Keeffe, and its title is The Faraway Nearby. Notice the surreal, supernatural title, The Faraway Nearby. It's an interpenetration that is not possible in integral time-space, but is a whole range of possibilities in conscious time-space, especially when you add the artist, as a sixth dimension. Now you're working with a very peculiar quality that's no longer a universe, but has a cosmic potential. Not potential so much, but a cosmic expansion. The spiritual person is expandable, not to the cosmos, but expandable as the cosmos. And the cosmos has this same, not a reduction to the person, not a focus to the person, not an integral to the person, but to have its harmonic calibrated by the person. So that in a very deep way, we are a calibration of the cosmos. In the Renaissance, the way in which this was first expressed 500 years ago, because they were unused to expressing anyone in this way for almost 1,200 years. It had been 1,000 years since there was anyone capable in Europe of even talking this way. Largely, the movement of the ability to talk mystically in this way went into Islam. and the development of Sufi qualities in Islam come from this ability to see that the spiritual person articulates and recalibrates the light of the universe into the radiance of a harmonic. One of the most powerful focuses of this was in the original surge of genius in Baghdad, when Baghdad was first really brought together as a civilized focus for a city. It's the time of Harun al-Rashid. It's the time of the Arabian Nights of Scheherazade, but it's also the time of a group of men and women called the Ikhwan al-Safdi, the Brethren of Light. And there in that Baghdad of the 700s, 8th century AD, one had the understanding that persons are not limited to the individuality of their mind, nor are they constrained by the karma or the ritual comportment, the rituals of their body. That both those forms are transformable. And not just transformable once, but they're transformable as long as they are able to admit a transform operator. So that the operating function in transformation is consciousness, visionary consciousness. And as long as consciousness is added, it's like a quintessential fifth dimension that makes magic the nature. That makes magic the whole natural ecology of integrating, so that now it is transformable indefinitely. But look here, when you add the emergence of a differential form like the prismatic person, like the differential artist, who is capable now of making a form, a lensed form by which you can objectify consciousness, not just in its transform of nature forms, but as its own emergence of a resplendent form of its own. Now you have something that is extraordinarily powerful. It isn't just that mind and body can be transformed by consciousness, but now a spirit objectivity comes into play, not as an integral, but as a radiant, as a differential. And just as consciousness weaves with experience, just as vision and myth weave through the transparency of symbols, now you have something that's very interesting. The artistic form of the differential person can play with the symbolic mind as a form. And it doesn't play just with an aspect of the mind, but it plays with all the aspects of the mind in their integral structure. So now the mind receives an invitation that it never had before, because the body couldn't issue this kind of invitation. But the spirit, as a conscious art form, can invite the symbolic mind to play, come out and play. And it's in the play of mind and artist that one begins to discover more and more that this is the source of the understanding that one would come under the rubric aesthetic. That an aesthetic is not a mental structure of a philosophy of art, but it is a conscious spectrum of the possibilities of play between mind and spirit, between artist and symbol. So that now symbols have acquired an enormous capacity that was never there before. In order for symbols to function just integrally in nature, they have to be able to bring images together in the imagination, to bring feelings together in the heart that one recognizes as an idea of heart in the mind. Language has to be able to come together so that one is able to symbolize thought, and all of these capacities are like tightening up, but when the invitation to play comes, the tightening up is not to go further, but to release the tension that holds the structure, not to have it dissemble or disravel, but to have it play. And initially, the mind does not know how to play. Its success was on its seriousness of its task to bring everything together and keep it together and make it really tight and really clear and really ordered and really structured. But the artist would be reduced and filtered, even almost filtered out of the picture, if they were to accept that limitation, because it now is a limitation. And so the artist is not antisocial, but is several orders of expanse beyond what a culture could even imagine. And that's why art is, when it comes emergent out, it carries the élan. The French word is best for this. It carries the élan of creative imagination. Always creating. It isn't just that it is creative at 5 in the morning or it's creative on Saturdays. Its creative imagination is, in alchemy they call it a tincture. It's a tincture of the flow of consciousness. And when consciousness was first engendered through the transparent symbols of the mind, in its pure first emergence, it doesn't emerge as a form, but just pure as a process itself. And it isn't like pure time consciousness, it's pure infinity consciousness. But when it acquires the ability to play with the mind, to play with symbols, then the artist playing with symbols transforms consciousness from its pure openness to being able to have color for the first time. And not just all the colors of the rainbow, though that was the prototype, the archetype. The ability to have a consciousness that has colors is one of the basic realities of art. Color, for the first time, emerges not even more important than a necessary form. Even more important, the old criteria of logic was necessary and sufficient. It is that art occurs to the extent that one's colorfulness is able to be free. One of the first artists to discover this quality we talked about over the last 2 weeks was Monet, but it received a jump in oomph from Matisse. And Matisse was almost shocked at the power that would come out, and because when he and his confrères first were painting with this intensity, they were called, in French the word is fauves, wild beasts. These are not artists, these are wild beasts. I mean, they're splashing vermilion and blue on the canvas and mixing in shards of yellow and bits of chartreuse, and look at this. But as that quality came into play, as color came into play, at the same time, you were having really deep genius artists like Kandinsky, just as genius as Matisse, but able to understand from their background. Kandinsky is a young man. He came from a very wealthy Moscow family, and they trained him to be a lawyer. But as people in places like Moscow, they would take summer vacations, and Kandinsky went to the far north of Russia, and there you found a different kind of people. You didn't find the urban Muscovites. You found some of the deep, ancient, primordial folk traditions of Finnish people up in the Kerala region of Russia. And all of a sudden, he wasn't interested in law anymore. He got interested that it wasn't just folk art, it was like the imagery was shimmering to him in its color. And so he, as a mature man, he said, I'm not going to be a lawyer. I'm not going to stay in Moscow. I'm not even going to stay in Russia. And he went down to Munich to join some wild Bavarian art schools, and pretty soon he began teaching there because he was already a mature man and very quickly adapted not just to art but to exploring the whole vocabulary of color in such a way that after a very few years, Kandinsky began to realize you don't have to put color into form. Color generates its own prismatic, differential formedness. And so some of the first abstract color paintings in the world were made by Kandinsky already by 1908, 1909. And we're going to use as the interval text, Kandinsky's little 90-page book that was published in 1912 concerning the spiritual in art, where he just blew it wide open, even by 1912, saying, we have previously not really appreciated and understood that we have capacities beyond belief, but they must be freed. They can in no way emerge real if they are constricted by any kind of conditional. And it isn't that one is just removing these conditions or bad conditions. Conditionality itself, which is rooted in ritual procedure, must be let go. In classic Buddhism, this is called the Abhidharma. One of the classics in the Abhidharma is how to identify conditioned reflexes on every single level, from the body and all through the mind, and how to let them go. And as one does this more and more, as Kandinsky discovered, as one does this more and more, its first surge is both a surprise at the intensity and the scale of it, and at the same time a disgust at how imprisoned you had been. Not just imprisoned because you were limited, but that you were forced to live in a disgusting way. That you were forced to have a taste and an addiction for things that are totally extraneous to your reality. And you thought you needed them. You would kill for them. Now you wouldn't have them even if they were thrust upon you. And so this wave of discovery and disclosure coincided with the conditions in the world historically that produced the First World War. And it seemed to everyone at the time that there's something almost occultly peculiar about this. That we discover a new ordering capacity and intensity for our freedom, and the whole civilization falls apart. What is going on? And as we've seen, Max Ernst is one of the greatest figures in that time. That is a visionary young man, and he was trying to really fit in with a kind of German cultivation, and then he was drafted and had to spend 4 years on the front lines in artillery, firing shells to kill Frenchmen. And as soon as the war was over, he left Germany and went to France. He went to Paris. He found that some of his closest friends are these guys who were on the other side that he was shooting artillery at for 4 years. They didn't feel animosity towards him, but they felt a kinship, that they were all young people being sacrificed. It's as if Abraham did kill his son Isaac, there would have been no further development whatsoever. And so they were trying to find a way, how can we not do this again? How can this be redone so it won't happen? And it wasn't just the Germans and the French, it was young people in neutral Switzerland, in Zurich. And so in between Hanover and Munich and Cologne in Germany, Paris, and some other places in France and Zurich and Switzerland, you had the neutral and the two sides of World War I, all of the young people coming together. And the first wave of disgust was Dada. And Max Ernst said later, when he was about 80 years old, someone was asking him about Dada, and they're going to have an exhibit of Dada. He said, why would you have an exhibit of bombs that were only meant to blow things up, to leave shards? But what was important for him was the realization that one has to go back and recut the body, the mind, and the spirit. Here he is. He's about 80-some years old here. He survived everything. And when he came out of the First World War, he could no longer stay with the wife that he had had before. He could no longer stay focused, even he had a new marriage to a beautiful young woman who slowly went psychotic on him, who had no stability, was so shame and guilt-ridden that she wanted to give everything away to the poor immediately and not leave anything at all. And Ernst realized, he tried for years to find a way to help, and it was too far gone. So he began to bring together different qualities of wildness to try and find a way in this wildness to make sure that something else is going to come out rather than what had come out before. And so he said that he developed the technique of collage. Collage is a new kind. It's a differential explosion. It takes off from Dada. It's not Dada to make a bomb, but it is a further expansion of that explosion to produce something that is completely surreal, is supernatural. And he said, the technique of collage is the systematic exploitation of the accidental or artificially provoked confrontation of two or more alien realities, both on an unfamiliar plane, and the flash of poetry which results from their mutual approach. It's like a nuclear explosion. It's like the power of an atomic bomb as compared to a bomb, but it's the atomic bomb of a new scale of art. That the creativity that was there in art, as art was there in civilizations before now has been exploded to powers that are maybe a million times what they were before. So that the quality of art on the planet surged to almost unheard of levels and produced 3 reactions at the same time. There were very few people who were participating, and because they were participating in this transform, they got it. And they began to explore new things. There was a very sizable population of people who were disgusted by what was coming out. These are not only wild beasts, these are crazy people, these are degenerate people, and they must be expunged. And then there was a great swath of the population that was completely uncaring, neutral. The number one person who was singled out as a degenerate was Max Ernst, and the person who singled him out was Adolf Hitler. And they held an exhibit in Nazi Germany, in Berlin, of degenerate art, and the prize degenerate piece was Max Ernst's La Belle Jardinière. It was a surreal, naked woman with birds, and she's tending the garden of surreality. And there's a famous photo of Hitler standing next to the picture just before he had it burnt publicly. So you had this peculiar thing of an artist standing against someone who represented in every aspect of themselves the most demonic empire imaginable. We still haven't gotten how vicious the Nazis were. More than you could imagine. More than you could believe. About 30 years ago, an old friend of mine who was a master numerologist and astrologer did the horoscopes of the top 258 Nazi figures. And every single horoscope had the same kind of flaw running through it, where they were not able to come together, but even further, they were psychotic and demonic in that they would forbid anyone else to come together, to be whole, to be spiritual. Every single one of them. Those kinds of figures were not limited to Germany, not limited to the Nazis. And we have today such individuals still there doing exactly that on world scale, still there. Because the transforms have not taken. Because it doesn't matter how talented an echelon, a group, a community, a level is, it takes a population of people who are alert, and that's what this education is for, is to engender a population of people. We've known for thousands of years how to pass it on one-to-one, or one to a community. But no one knew how to pass it on to 5 or 6 billion at the same time. We can do that now, and that's what we're up to do. But it is a patient going through. It's like learning to play a musical instrument. It takes the continuity of application, at least 2 years, in order to see the entire array in its double ambit. And only then, and it's not a question of intelligence to understand it all. It isn't about understanding it all. The understanding mind is only 1/8 at most. The crucial aspect is to develop one's own differential person. More than the individuality of the mind, to become an artist in your life. That your life is a work of art and is not just a success at surviving on the cultural level, or a success of integrating on the mental level, or of doing the right thing so you get by and no one bugs you or suspects anything and you can just go ahead. Even success on all 3 of those would not include nature in her mysteriousness and would blind you to mystic experience and forbid you to learn enough to be able to intuit that consciousness is a completely different kind of process. And so no wonder the yearning for a better life is mistranslated all the time into, well, you have to do our rituals. Here's our program for these rituals. Or these are the ideas that you have to learn and master, and if you pay us enough, we'll let you in on the secret. And you'll have success. You can sell the hell out of hell and still make heavenly profits. And you get that kind of rigmarole, and it is a flaw that has been there for a very long time and reinforced to the level that in culture, not in history, because we'll find that history is completely different, but the parfait of the levels of sediment in culture are almost archaeologically deep. It is extraordinary how deep and how complex it is. And it is almost a devastating task to be able to know how to go through that and to go through it and define how much that is really bad. We're talking about really bad. It's still there and still viable, still in place. When you look at the photographs of the coronation of the new pope, and you look at the classic sculptural friezes of the Assumption of the Roman emperors in the 1st century AD, Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, you will be able to see the configuration, because the configurations like that do not change. They're dictated by the cultural configurations that are put doctrinarily into place and ritually played out as if it were like an old scenario, which it is. The difficulty is that the scenario doesn't just play out with millions in crowds, it plays out in the way in which the minds of individuality echo that, and the character is squeezed into that configuration, and the ritual comportment is exactly the same so that one can discover. It's like 2,400 years ago, in the midst of what was supposed to be the most glorious achievement of Athens, that they fell into a war that lasted 3 generations and decimated the Athenian Empire. The first really great historian, Thucydides, says in his Peloponnesian War, he says, knowing what I know now about human beings and about history, I write this not to make a record of the past, but to make a complex presentation that speaks more to the future, because knowing what I do know about human beings and about history, all of this will occur again and again and again and again until we stop doing that. There was a beautiful fairy tale film made a couple of years ago called Groundhog Day with Bill Murray, of the reporter that goes to a little Pennsylvania town to report on Groundhog Day, and he gets caught in one of these time loops where he has to relive that day. And he relives that day 1,000,000 times. Because he does, he gets to know everything about everyone in that town. He knows every single aspect about everyone. And it's only at a certain fairy tale moment that he's released for that, and he can wake up to a new day. This entire planet is caught in Groundhog Day. No one out there is able to release this because it is not dependent anymore on some genius guru to release it. No more Buddhas, no more Christ. It is a function of the community of the population recognizing harmonically each other and building the resonances so that that freedom is released, not made. It's already there. In an ultimate Hollywood novel, What Makes Sammy Run, by Bud Schulberg, his protagonist, Sammy Glick, says, "What's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable." He has another saying, "Never promote a promoter." Here's another one, "Man is born naked, he dies with clothes on, he cheated somewhere. So don't tell me I'm bad. It's only what we do." We have to change not only what we do, but how the thought integrates, and in between, how language also then functions, so that thought, word, and deed are transformed together. And if they're transformed together, it's called combing. You don't get a hodgepodge of transforming a little bit here, and then you have to readjust here, and then this doesn't work, but all of it together. And that kind of harmonic transform can only occur if the spiritual person has emerged. You don't have to be super powerful, just enough to be real. And to find others who are real in that way. That community is an eternal registry. Doesn't matter what star system you're on. It works that way. When Max Ernst was trying to find his way out, he wrote two very interesting poems. One is called The Black Circle, and the other is called The Sun. We'll see that Kandinsky also wrote poems. George O'Keeffe wrote poems. Here's The Black Circle by Max Ernst, translated from German. "I am the sun. I am a white square. I am the quadrature of the spirit. I am the final nebula. I am the immaculate cognition. I am the abstract conception." The other poem is The Sun. "I am no black circle. I am no white square. I am no blue haze. I am heaven. I am hell. I am the bridal bed of heaven and hell. I am the spouse of all planets. The elements radiate the resplendence of my love." And here are the two paintings that go with them. This is the sun. And you can see here in the sun is a jewel-like transparency in the midst of a spectrum of energy registry. And the energy registry is in such a way that there is a language that is possible, but that the language has no ability to be translated. One has to learn this language in and of itself, and one of the characteristics of Max Ernst's mystical, transcendent, surreal language was that every character, every word in it was completely different from every other word, and it was never repeated. So that every word was unique, so that its grammar was only able to be determined in the instant that one was using it. That there was no repeatable word or phrase or syllable anywhere, and the language was like little squiggle drawings, and he made whole books of this to convey. The spirit language is not a confusion of tongues. It is the full spectrum of all possibility of language, and is only confusing to those that would like to reduce it. So he had a new way to express himself, called the obscure gods. There is something like a transcendent sun, but it's not a sun over a planet. It is one's own spirit, transcendent through transparency over one's individual life, that this new spirit hovers like a carrier of infinity over the triple flow of nature, experience, and vision. One finds this in the ancient Egyptian wisdom tradition. The body of the deceased is laid out with a candle at the head and at the foot. Hasidic German tradition has the same thing with candles like that. It comes from memories of ancient Egypt. But in the Egyptian thing, one has the Horus, the divine falcon hawk, carrying in a claw the sign for infinity, which is a circle with a bar underneath it, and carries this as like a lamp of eternal light over the supine dead person so that they are literally remagnetized, not back into another life, but recalibrated into life eternal. It's not just about resurrection of coming with Ra when the sun rises the next day, or coming back in reincarnation through a transmigration of soul to another life, but it's coming into life itself, which can be simultaneously in many forms in many places. That spirit person is kaleidoscopic. Next week, we go to Frank Lloyd Wright and Hiroshige, two of George O'Keeffe's favorites. When she was invited to visit Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin, she said that Frank told her he had a vision of nature more natural than nature itself. They got along. Thank you.